given total freedom, will default to what cognitive psychologists call the path of least resistance. Like, you'll do the convenient thing, you'll do the thing you've seen before, the thing you're used to, or the thing that seems easiest. So in order to get creative, we basically have to have constraints.
You're listening to the Elevate podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Glazer. Join me as I talk to world-class performers about how they build their capacity and reach greater heights in leadership, business, and life, and how you can do the same. Welcome to the Elevate podcast. Our quote for today is from Alexander Graham Bell. We often look so long and so regretfully upon the closed door that we do not see the one which is open for us. My guest today is David Epstein. David is a journalist and the #1 New York Times best-selling author of Range, one of my favorite books. And he's previously worked as a senior writer for Sports Illustrated and an investigative journalist for Pro Publica. His new book, Inside the Box: How Constraints Make Us Better, publishes the day that this episode airs. David, welcome. It's great to have you on the Elevate podcast.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
And congrats on Pub Day.
Yeah, thanks. It's it's
I
a
know
lot,
the feeling.
You know?
Yeah, it is a lot.
Yeah.
As I say to people, it's basically like taking 6 months trying to get a year's worth of demand into 1 week. That's kind of how I described it.
It's a good way to put it.
So Inside the Box opens with your childhood, which makes this a natural place to start. Can you walk us through the injury that kind of changed your trajectory and the unexpected academic discovery that it led to?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that because nobody's asked me about it yet.
I like hearing that.
So I was just a sports fanatic when I was a kid, and football, basketball, baseball. Would wake up early in the morning to watch the same SportsCenter segment play twice in a row. Literally the same segment. And one day in 8th grade, while playing schoolyard football at gym class, I had a really good throwing arm.
Yeah.
And so I was the person who threw for kickoff, because you threw instead of kicking in this kind of schoolyard football. And on the throw, my arm snapped, like on the follow through, in a spiral, like completely separated the bone.
Is that like Tommy John like thing or what? No.
No, I mean, Tommy John's a ligament tear. So in this case, it was just fully the bone snapped.
Oh, the bone snapped. I thought you heard like a tendon snap. The bone snapped. Wow.
Bone snapped in a spiral completely through the upper arm, the humerus, the upper arm, basically. And
I have no medical aptitude, so that's why that was my problem. We don't have any science genes in our family.
I've only seen this happen one other time, and to a pitcher, and he had to have his arm amputated because he had some kind of cancer that was, and so what exactly was going on for me, we'll never know. Like, I got to the hospital, and at first they were telling me to sort of move my hand for x-rays. I felt sick. I was really nauseous. And I was saying that I was with my eyes closed, and they were like, no, you're not. And eventually I looked and realized that it was because the bone was totally separated. I was rotating my shoulder. And so I was feeling like my hand was in a certain place, because that's like where your brain thinks it is. But it wasn't there. And because they thought there's no way I could have broken my arm because I didn't get hit.
Right.
But it turned out I had this freak injury. We'll never know why. The doctor who set the bone said, if there hadn't been witnesses, they would have thought one of my parents had like twisted my arm until it snapped in a spiral. And he said, like, maybe you had some air pocket in your bone or some kind of weakness. We'll just never know, because once it breaks, whatever that evidence is gone, basically. So who knows? But it was devastating for my life at the time, because sports was all I cared about. And I had to have my arm strapped to my body, not just a cast, but like immobilized. And so I couldn't play sports, and school was terrible. Like, I couldn't put my arm through a sleeve. But one of the interesting things that happened, a few interesting things, but one was I had a French class at the time, and our tests were where you'd have to listen to someone speaking French on a recording, and you had a worksheet that would follow along with the same text, but then it had blanks, and you had to catch the words that you would fill in for the blanks while you were going. And since I couldn't write, my writing hand was strapped to my body, so I couldn't write fast enough to keep up with these tests. So I started memorizing the words as they would fly by, and using mnemonic devices, like methods, usually some sports related idea that I would attach to the words that I could remember it. And then I would go back at the end and write very, very slowly with my left hand. And I started doing much better than I had done before. And so I started using mnemonic devices for all sorts of things. And like now, these days, if I give an hour-long keynote talk, I memorize it.
Yeah.
Largely using mnemonics. And years, decades after that, I came across one of the most famous studies of memory research ever done where a Carnegie Mellon student was taken from being able to memorize 7 digits in a row to being able to memorize 80 digits in a row. And it was done with sports-related mnemonics. Like he would attach these number sequences to sports things so he could remember them. And so it was an interesting, it also got me because I couldn't play contact sports for a year. I couldn't play football my freshman year in high school, which I wanted to do. So I ended up running cross country just to stay in shape. And that got me interested in running. And eventually, I went on to be a Division I 800 meter runner, university record holder and all this stuff. So this horrible freak thing that happened that devastated me in the short term ended up leading to these things both academically and athletically that I just never would have done had I not had these constraints foisted upon me. So what looked terrible in the short term ended up causing me to explore in ways that I just would not have done if not forced.
And when did you make the deliberate shift into full-time writing and journalism?
Yeah, later. So I was like my academic background, like I studied geology and astronomy in college. I went to grad school. I was like living in a tent in the Arctic studying the carbon cycle. I thought I was going to be a scientist. And when I was a national level runner, one of my training partners died at the end of a race from this condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's like
that one I've actually heard of. Yeah.
And I decided I wanted to write about, I realized that we could like save some people by raising awareness of this. And so I decided I wanted to merge my interest in sports and science and write about this, sudden cardiac death in athletes for Sports Illustrated. And so I left the track to become a scientist and started taking like any job I could get in journalism basically, and worked my way to Sports Illustrated and did exactly that. And then I kind of became the science writer at Sports Illustrated. So basically left grad school training to be a scientist and got into writing and eventually made my way to Sports Illustrated where I became the science writer.
Well, this arc, I can see how this arc works. Usually it takes a little more work, but let's dive into Range first, because I think it's the foundation for what followed and definitely the new book. But the central argument in Range is that late specialization after a period of broader general training produces better outcomes than early focus. And you open with this story in the book, which I think a lot of people remember, of Tiger Woods and Roger Federer. Woods was sort of hyper trained as a golf prodigy, one could argue from birth. Federer was just a really good athlete and then settled into tennis later. Why is that pairing such a useful frame for the argument? And not to pick on Tiger, but with the last couple of weeks here, the argument seems to be getting better and better with age when you look sort of at what's happened to him and maybe the cost that he paid for all that intense specialization.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to draw a causal link between his very narrow childhood and an adult problem. So I mean, because I use Tiger in that opening of the book in the introduction called Roger versus Tiger as an example of success, because I'm talking about his athletic success. And then I contrast it with Roger Federer, who again played a dozen different sports, delayed specialization. And the reason I picked them both is they're both examples of success. My question was, which one of these is the norm and which is the exception? And I'd like to contrast those two because they're, kind of equally famous, basically, same era, everything like that. And the science shows that the Roger path is by far the norm and the Tiger path is the exception. And even tennis enthusiasts don't don't anything. Everyone knows Tiger Woods' developmental path, right? It's probably the most famous story of modern development. Like maybe Mozart would be second. But
the Williams sisters were kind of a similar version of
Williams
Tiger.
sisters.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Although, you know what? That's what I thought. And I gave a talk to a small group about just some of the stuff in Range. And Serena Williams was sitting in the front row for this talk. And I'm like, oh man, this is terrible. Because I can marshal all the data I want and show what's the norm and what's the exception. And the norm, again, being this broader early so-called sampling period before you pick. But if the GOAT stands up and says, you're an idiot, it's going to be a bad day in front of that audience, no matter how much data you have behind it. She raises her hand to ask the first question. I'm sweating bullets. And she says, I think my father was ahead of his time. He had me do track and field, taekwondo, gymnastics, ballet. He had me and Venus learn how to throw a football for the overhand snapping motion of a serve and all this stuff. And I was thinking, I was a senior writer at Sports Illustrated. I'd never heard that. Not that they didn't have a lot of tennis folks practice, obviously, when they were young.
It's not in the King.
No. Yeah. It's just this, even that story gets more complicated when you look closer at it. It's after that, I asked her could I catch up with you later in the day and interview you about this? And then I added a little bit about it to the afterword of the paperback of Range, because she then sat for an interview with me.
Have you studied at all whether, again, there's success, but what the arc of it looks like, right? Whether, when we look at Tiger, like how does the peak hold? How does it fall off? Particularly, I would assume, and now I'm making this up, and you can tell me if there's any science, that if there was one thing that was your whole purpose in life, and you started hitting some roadblocks in it, I could assume that would come apart a little bit more, rather than if you had lots of different things that sort of filled your kind of needs and wants.
Absolutely. And there's multiple different lines of evidence that support what you're saying. Some of it about building your identity house, right? Where you don't want to you want multiple rooms in your identity house. Right. You don't want to be living in one all the time.
We see this with business people. They sell their business and they retire, and they die or fall apart within, a year. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there actually is, if you're asking sports specific, there actually is research showing that often when kids are deemed very talented early on, they'll be, their development will start to get accelerated. More resources will pour into them or whatever. And they'll be moved into what some of these scientists call a more restrictive environment, in a much more programmed and structured plan, much more like an adult, basically. And when they then have their first loss, which maybe is just other people catching up, like biologically maturing, and so they're not as dominant, the quitting rates are enormous, even higher among girls. But so it is, I think, if everything is in this one basket, it can really impact your resilience. And for adults, there's this line of research showing that if adults have a hobby unrelated to their work, it improves their self-efficacy, their feeling of competence and ability to overcome a challenge. Where if all of their activities are too closely related to their work, it decreases their self-efficacy. So I think there are all these lines of research showing benefits for basically diversifying your identity in terms of resilience.
Well, the people who didn't read Range are probably ones leading or sending their kids to club sports. So since you wrote this book, the intensity and proliferation of club sports, I live more in a soccer area, and now there are these 10 and 11-year-olds starting club soccer for whom they can't do other sports or play on other things, and they're doing it 5 days a week. And so we're seeing the consequences, right? We're seeing repetitive injury. We're seeing burnout, where they just get tired of it in high school and they're walking away entirely. Why are people going in the other direction of the data here? I guess this false belief that this is the great hope of getting their kids to college sports or pros, which the odds have not improved. When you look at the industrialization complex of youth sports, and you build the pyramid there's no more real college slots or pro slots, right? But there's a massive funnel underneath it. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of this has nothing to do with what's best for the kids, I don't think.
Very little of it does.
Yeah. When I lived in New York City, there was a U8 travel soccer team that met near me. U8. Is there a human being in the world who thinks that 7-year-olds can't find good enough competition in a city of 9 million people that they have to travel?
Oh, yeah. My friends' kids are on these travel teams, even 14-year-olds, and they're not the best in New York, but they travel for these, exhibition competitions to Texas. And it's just I understand if you were the best team in New York and then you were in the club finals and you went the best, but this is just unnecessary to travel out
more
of state.
Time traveling than playing. But in that case, at least with the team that I saw in New York, this was about an adult locking in a customer pipeline where it's if the kids aren't on the U8, then they can't be on U9. So it sets up a system where if you don't play the game, you don't even have a chance to participate.
Right.
There's places that do this totally differently. Norway doesn't allow, which is I would say right now probably the greatest, at least per capita, sports country in history.
And I think happiest place to live, right, in the world. They're constantly top 5.
I think Finland just won, but Finland, Norway was up there.
Generally Scandinavian,
Scandinavia does very well. Yeah, Finland. I mean, Norway just won 50% more gold medals than the U.S. at the Olympics. They dominated.
Oh yeah, that
the
guy.
Olympics.
What's his? He was a absolute beast. The cross country guy, right?
Cross country guy, yeah. But they won a ton of stuff. I mean, in a recent Summer Olympics, they won beach volleyball. You don't usually think about that with Norway, right? And they have, people at the top of soccer, golf, tennis, track and field, and this is a country. It's like the size of metropolitan Atlanta, and they do not allow kids to be deselected before age 13. So adults are not allowed to keep score. They're not allowed to rank kids. So they view mass participation as aligned with elite performance, not in conflict.
Yeah, and figuring out, it may be that your parents started you in elite soccer, but as you said, you love basketball, but there's no time to play basketball.
You're better at basketball.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So-called match quality, it turns out to be really, the earlier you choose, the more likely you put the wrong person in the wrong spot, basically, and especially when that's pre-puberty.
Well, what's interesting is you said this, and I hadn't thought about it before, but so maybe we'll make a intellectual discovery here. Look, if you're thinking about what do you get from cross-cultural opportunities, the one thing historically people always said was about sports was you learn how to be a good teammate and a team member, right? And a lot of team is competing against your town and winning the high school championship, but these kids are playing in games where honestly the team doesn't matter. They're playing for coaches and spots. And so they're actually like losing one of the biggest things that could probably help them in other areas, which is about being a good teammate.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I really worry with the way youth sports in this country is developing, again, because some places I think do better. And maybe one thing that hampers us. Well, so yes, I think there are a lot of things, virtues of sport that we give lip service to that we are then not really supporting in practice. Including what you're talking about, like being devoted to a specific team that you can't just, move away from, and not only pursuing your own individual goals. And I think, the structure of things is just not shaping up to support those values that we want. And I think at the elite level, the U.S., we can get away with having poor development on an individual basis because we have so many athletes.
Yeah.
So take my sport, track and field.
We have so many sports in the U.S. A lot of countries, there's three things people do, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the NCAA system, for my sport, track and field, there's 30 to 40,000 young adults being supported in pretty serious training by the NCAA system. If I had to guess, I would guess that's probably roughly equal to the rest of the world combined, who are, people being supported in doing pretty serious training. So we can do all sorts of stuff wrong with individual development in lots of our sports and still do well at the elite level. Whereas countries that to get to some of the ideas of inside the box, like the countries that are more constrained, like Norway, like Australia, which has like 6 pro sports and not a big population, they have to be a lot more concerned with individual development. And so they have much more holistic development pipeline.
Well, last question, and then we'll get there. But I know you made a strong case in range that outside of sports, that the best problem solvers and companies and organizations draw on ideas outside their own field. I mean, I remember reading about the Medici effect. I think the whole Renaissance was based on this concept of, people were from all different disciplines were working with each other. Same thing in the workplace, right? I think there's a pressure for people to specialize versus like go learn and bring back stuff and think about a problem in a different way.
Totally. Two things to say about that. One, since you're mentioning the Renaissance, there's a famous econ paper by an economist named Ed Glazer, a brilliant guy, about what's called the spillover effect.
Yeah.
It's Glaeser.
Oh, okay.
Sadly.
Yeah.
So he wrote this famous paper on something called the spillover effect, where there was this debate from 2 very prominent econ camps about what causes cities to drive so much innovation and make people so much more productive than in non-cities. And the 2 basically competing theories were regional specialization. So you focus a particular industry in an area and that, draws talent to it, infrastructure, et cetera. And the other was spillover, where you actually cram lots of different types of organizations together and people and solutions start jumping from one industry and organization to another. So it's like actually the mixing.
Yeah.
And what he showed is that it's spillover is the answer, is that you want to cram together all these really different people and they take analogies from one industry or one problem and they bring it over to some other. So he did this amazing profile of Detroit back in the Henry Ford days, where it was like Silicon Valley. There are people working on boats and carriages. And then you had people like Henry Ford would say, oh, I can combine that motor from that with that carriage over there and make something new. And then when it became a one industry town, that's when it was sort of on the path to dying, where people were not, you weren't having that spillover effect anymore. So that's the one thing. The other, there's just a new paper out called in the journal Science. So one of the two most prestigious scientific journals in the world. Recent discoveries on the acquisition of the highest levels of human performance. That's the name, right? Yes. And it looked at about 30,000 careers of musicians, scientists, athletes, and basically backed up the thesis of range. I mean, they cited some of the same papers I did, but what they found was that the things that predict top youth performance, including really early narrow specialization, actually become negative predictors of adult performance. So almost none of the top youth people were the top. There were some, but the 90% of the top adults were different from the top youth people. And they showed this, to your point, outside of sports. So they looked at scientists. The Nobel laureates in the research they looked at progressed more slowly in their careers than their peers because they were more interdisciplinary early on. So it gave them this power later on, but it actually meant they got tenure later. They didn't publish high impact papers as early and all this kind of stuff. So that breadth becomes a superpower, but it just makes you look like you're behind early on. And
in a world that doesn't really value delayed gratification, that's a problem. It occurs to me that correlates to the data people say around like where SAT and test scores correlate to how people do in the 101 classes in college. And then as they move up to the classes and it's more about participation, understand, not just getting the right X's and O's, that correlation tends to fall apart a little bit.
Interesting. I don't know that particular research.
Yeah.
So I'll take your word for it, but I can certainly see how it's
similar. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've read that, but it's interesting. It's what aligns. So look, that brings us to the new book, Inside the Box. I think in some ways it seems a little bit to me like the sequel to Range. I think if Range made the case for
glad you said that.
the generalist path, the new book is kind of how you turn that into achievement. So what pulled you towards that question?
That's how I feel. So I know on the face of it, Inside the Box can seem, how constraints make us better can seem contradictory to Range. But to me, there were two main things that drew me to this topic. One was basically just as you just implied, the most common question I was getting from people after Range was, okay, I've got this broad toolbox. Now what? Yeah. Or sometimes I'm so curious and so wide ranging that, what do I do with it? I want to bounce around. And so in some ways, this was my answer to it. Once you get that broad toolbox, you have to focus that into achievement and satisfaction. And so I wanted to write, look at the obvious follow-up question, which was how do you put boundaries around your projects and your life in a way that can lead to achievement and satisfaction.
Because if too much focus is too good, I always say the same amount of energy in a prism can refract and be a lot of pretty light, and in a laser can cut glass. Or how do you not spread yourself just too thin, right?
Yeah, and there's a hefty dose, just like with Range. The older I've gotten, the more I realize there's a big dose of me-search in my books, not just research, like trying to understand my own life. Because I'm a generalist. I've zigzagged all over the place. Yeah. And I have also been terrible at putting constraints around my own work. So for my first two books, I wrote 150% the length of a book to get one book because I didn't draw good boundaries around the project, and I have this expansive curiosity. And so then I had to cut, my first book, I cut a trip to Arctic Sweden, for goodness sake, that I would have realized that I'd done more planning and had boundaries up front, that it wasn't going to fit. And then after Range, I became a dad. I'm like, I cannot be taking trips to Arctic Sweden if they're not going to be useful for the book. I need to be more efficient with my time. And so I wanted to learn how to draw better boundaries around my own workday, in my life, around my projects. So this time around, I went through this kind of long process, but where I forced myself to write on one single page a structural architecture for the book before I started. I kind of got this idea from a character in the book, Tony Fadell, who was the lead designer of the iPod and co-founded the company Nest, where his main advice to entrepreneurs is to write the press release before you start the project, because it gives you this vision of where you're going, but also it's like he calls it a bounding box. It's like this shows you what your priorities are. So you have it written down and you don't just move the goalposts. So I made this architecture for the book before I started writing. It's actually right here. One page and one page only for anybody who might be.
And is it pretty close to
I'll
where
show
you
it to
ended
you and
up?
you can just describe it. Oh yeah. So as you can see, I guess other people can, but I ended up writing as small as possible as if I was trying to like cheat my own system. But if it's not on that page, if it's not on that page, it is not in the book. And consequently, the book ended up 20% shorter than my previous two, and I didn't overwrite it, and the writing's much tighter, and I think the book is more coherent because of that. So I would never not do it this way again.
You took the Mark Twain
part
quote.
Of the book was,
sorry, I would have written you a shorter letter if I had more time.
If I had more time, totally. So I these are things that I want to, that's very, very often the case. Things I'm writing about are things that I want to be better at myself, and that I hope that other people
that makes sense. Or justifying why we do is why our path is the right one. So look, you're a deep researcher. And one thing that jumped out was how you spent hours with Pixar founder Ed Catmull watching a documentary and discussing elements of it. Talk about the value of that sort of deep but meandering research, because I think that's kind of part of the story. Yeah.
So in this case, I wanted Ed. So in the first two chapters of the book, after the intro, I'm writing about, I'm contrasting two companies. Yeah. One is this one called General Magic that had all the talent and resources in the world. They had they had the vision of the iPhone, 15 years, more than that, like almost 20 years basically before it would exist. And they went public in the first so-called concept IPO. They had like such an amazing idea and collection of talent that Goldman Sachs took them public without a product, just with an idea.
Yeah.
And it ends up becoming a complete disaster. Like they have so much resources, so much talent that they can build anything. And so they do. Yeah. And the project just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and spirals out of control. And I contrast that with Pixar, which at the same time had this equally big vision of making the first computer animated feature film. And this was a time when computer graphics were like solid objects rotating on a black screen. Yeah. And they end up pulling it off. And one of the things I thought was interesting was that Ed really devoted his career to putting constraints in place that help channel people's creative ideas, because he understood that his feeling is that like ideas are not, there's tons of ideas in organizations. It's really a process for like setting up the bumpers in the bowling alley and getting them to trundle in the right direction. That's much more rare. And so General Magic, the company I wanted to contrast.
Yeah, that was going to be the next one. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a documentary about it. So I went with Ed, and I wanted to know what Ed would think about General Magic. And the best way I could do it was to sit next to him while he watched the movie and ask him to talk out loud, because then you can write in a way.
And he hadn't seen it. He hadn't seen it before, so you were just getting his raw reaction to it.
Yeah, and the reason I like to do that is because that's the closest you can get to being able to narrate someone's actual thoughts.
Yeah.
Right? Is instead of me asking him, I saw this in this movie, what do you think about it? Like him watching it and then be like, Ed, please speak your thoughts out loud. So I can actually write what he's thinking while he's watching that. So I thought it was a useful reporting technique.
And look, no one's heard of General Magic. Why don't you tell us what it is that they were trying to do? Because that's interesting.
Yeah. So again, this was a company founded by three guys, two of whom were designers of the original Apple Macintosh, and one of whom had a job inside of Apple. This guy named Mark Peratt, who his job inside of Apple was to see the future of technology after personal computing.
Yeah.
So we're talking like late 80s. And Peratt has this vision of, I read his PhD dissertation in my reporting. And on the first page, he coins the term information economy. So he created that term. And reading the PhDs from 1976, and it is amazing how prescient it was. He's like, there's a communications and information technology revolution coming. Most people have no idea. It's going to change everything about work. It's going to lead to problems with misinformation. It's going, commerce is going to be virtual, all this stuff. The internet did not exist.
Yeah.
Right? Like almost nobody even had computers at home.
So he was clearly visionary. Yeah.
So visionary. I mean, again, maybe that's why his job inside of Apple was being a visionary.
Yeah.
And so he was visionary with General Magic. In 1989, he sketched, I saw one of his notebooks. 1989, he sketched a thin glass rectangle with no protruding buttons, just a touch screen where you could download apps. Again, this is pre-internet, and it would be a phone and a computer, and you could play games, and you could get airline tickets and send messages. 1989. So he absolutely saw the future. The problem was as he said, one of the reasons they went public so early was, as he said, to create heaven for engineers where they could imagine and play, only be limited by their imaginations. And he said, what else could anyone ask for? And it turned out the answer was a little less freedom, is they had so much freedom and so much talent, they could do anything. So everyone who had a good idea, they just built it.
Right.
One of the emblematic interviews to me, this guy, Steve Perlman,
Yeah.
he was an engineer at General Magic charged with creating a calendar function. And so he creates it to go from 1904 to 2096. Checks it in. Fine, I'm done. No, someone else comes to him and says, hey, Steve, someone might make apps that goes like way farther back in time. You got to make this calendar app bigger. Okay, so he makes it to go from year 1 instead. Checks it in. Done. No, then another team comes to him and says, Steve, why are you starting with an arbitrary religious context? You should go back to the beginning of astronomical time. So then he programs the calendar function to go from the beginning of the universe.
Right. None of this being any functional use cases. Yeah.
It would have been 4 lines of code if he'd stuck with 1904 to 2096, but instead it took months. And so this was just emblematic of everything at General Magic, where they didn't define they called their user Joe Sixpack. Nobody bothered to define who the heck that was. So after several years of missed deadlines, they realized like nobody knew the guy. So they had not identified a clear problem they were solving. And when the device appeared, their personal communicator, it had so much stuff on it that the user experience was choppy, it was confusing, the battery life was terrible, it was expensive. Meanwhile, people inside of General Magic who bit off tiny pieces and were focused on it did some important things. So one low-level service engineer, when the internet exploded while they were missing deadlines, started a website called Auction Web that was facilitating online auctions. And he went to the chief financial officer and general counsel and said, hey, look at this. It's facilitating commerce between strangers. Isn't that what we want to do? And offered it to them. And they said, nah, too small. We have much bigger vision. So he took it and left, and that became eBay.
Yeah.
So Piero Midiar was a low-level service engineer.
Yeah.
They had a third-party app developer who created an app where you could use a stylus and make strokes and it would be turned into writing. And when it was clear that things weren't going great at General Magic.
Like Palm Pilot.
Well, it was Palm Pilot. So he took it out. When it was clear General Magic wasn't going to work, he decided to make his own device. He said, I've identified a clear customer problem. It's busy professionals want to sync their contacts and calendar on the go with their computer and take it on the go. And so he said, I'm going to make it one that's just calendar contacts memo pad, period. And again, General Magic said, our partners are AT&T and Motorola and Apple and all that. Like, there's no chance. You can't beat us. And he destroyed them. The Palm Pilot also became a hit, right? Because they just could not figure out how to do something instead of everything.
Well, as you're saying this, and I know you must have written the book probably a year or two ago at this point, but I can't help thinking about the AI industry, right? And how it could benefit from some more constraints. And maybe the lost chapter, if you were writing it now. They seem to just be operating with a blank check. Unlimited data centers, unlimited money. Yeah. I'm curious whether you think it's good or bad. I had a thesis even a couple of months ago. We did a podcast talking about it with my team. And I said, look, I don't think all these models can build for everything, right? You just saw OpenAI dump Sora this week. And I think that's even from a cost computing standpoint. What's the danger when everyone in AI is trying to act like everything's a win-all race and spending money like it's growing on trees? Yeah,
well, I think even if the technology is transformative, it's a bubble.
Yeah.
Right? Even if the technology is transformative. And I think there's a lot of mismatch between the sexiness of the tool and actually solving people's problems.
Yeah.
So, there's this new term coming out of, I think it started with some research at MIT called work slop, where people are just creating an incredible amount of mediocre stuff that's causing more burden on the people they're sending it to. So have you seen this cartoon where one guy's saying, AI is great. I gave it this 4 bullet points. It turned it into a 6-page memo and then emails it. And the person on the other side is like, AI is great. It took this 6-page memo and turned it into 4 bullet points. So this MIT research on work slop is it's not adding to productivity the way that we might have thought. And so I think there's an issue with these tools being so expansive and not really being targeted at specific problem solving. And I've seen this in organizations too, where, because there's one particular AI company that I kind of embedded with a little bit. And the organizations that use them are saying, we need AI. And because they feel behind if they don't have it. So we need AI, but they haven't identified a specific problem
that's when you're in the
that they should match the tool to. And so I end up implementing stuff, and it's just like a problem because it didn't really well define the problem they were actually trying to solve. So they implement something, and then it's like you create all this work slop and have to figure out how to reel it back.
And what's interesting is the way that I think it's going to go. And again, these mass models, I think like who's the audio company and who's the video company and who's the work one. I mean, the way I've made it work personally and professionally is with customization and putting constraints around it. It is much better when you reduce what it's supposed to do and narrow its focus than let it go off. And look, I come from the marketing world, and you're going to have to either this becomes a marketing book or a company launch book, or you'll do the little derivative, because the two problems that companies have, and one is sort of a war thing, like building your front, is one, they don't pick a defined user audience that gets them launched. Having done multiple businesses over the years, I'm always like, and with clients, what gets us? So we tried to sell large global projects at our company, and we couldn't, even though we had a global platform, because there was a lot of politics, and we just started get into one company and get a global MSA, and then we would grow. If we tried to get the whole thing, we wouldn't get it if we just got over the wall. So one is the focus on the customer and finding the one thing that they're willing to turn over money for. And then two, and I'll bring some examples if you don't have them, they might be interesting for your research. I've heard CEOs, is like companies historically that didn't have enough marketing money did amazing things. Right? They got super gritty. that seems to be two requirements for success for building a company.
I mean, that like when you don't have resources, you're forced to get resourceful. The venture capitalist Bill Gurley, who famously invested in Uber, Zillow, all these things. He told me when I first got interested in constraints and told him I was thinking about writing about it, because he was a big fan of range. So we came into contact through that. And he said, constraints, we have a saying in venture, more startups die of indigestion than starvation.
I've heard that. It's a great
too
line.
Much, not too little. And then Tony Fadell actually said that same thing. He was like, that's my line. And so multiple people are claiming that they came up with this line, I think. But it is interesting, right? There's so many, and Ed Catmull with Pixar, he said, I found if we put too many resources early, things get sloppy. So you want to keep it like tight and lean early. And I think this gets at one of the major underlying points in Inside the Box, which is our brain, as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham puts it, our brains are not made for thinking. They're made for preventing us from having to think whenever possible, because thinking is energetically costly.
Yeah.
And so
cheat sheets. Yeah.
Given total freedom, will default to what cognitive psychologists call the path of least resistance. Like you'll do the convenient thing. You'll do the thing you've seen before, the thing you're used to, or the thing that seems easiest. So in order to get creative, we basically have to have constraints. You basically have to have the typical solution, or the one that you would do with complete freedom, blocked. And that's sort of the only way that you can be really creative, because of how our brains work.
So I'm curious, do you know the Honest Tea and Stonyfield yogurt examples?
No.
Oh, because they could be.
I know those.
They could be case
products,
studies in your book, and I actually they came to me because I heard both their CEOs speak. So Honest Tea was like struggling early on, didn't have a lot of money, very constrained, and so they set up these unmanned pop-up stores in cities with a bunch of bottles and a money box and a donation box where you could take it and the suggested donation. And what they did was they videoed it and created a which city is more honest sort of benchmark. And the news like got all over it, and they got millions of impressions. They got double-digit sales growth in every market because the news covered it. And it was called the Honest Index, and it was like a shoestring budget thing that would have worked much better. The other one, and these are That's perfect. Funny. So Stonyfield had gotten into the Chicago market, and in order to like stay there, they were told that they had to basically triple their market share in 3 months to stay at this supermarket or whatever it was. So Gary Hirschberg, like they told him it was going to cost, I don't know, $50,000 in advertising to do that. And he's like, I don't have that. But he decided to go to the Transportation Authority and, he gave out 80,000 cups of yogurt to people on an L with a coupon celebrating them for taking the train, and sort of made a whole initiative out of taking the train, and ended up getting the market share in like weeks, not months or whatever he got to. And it was a fifth of what they said. So very, again, examples that could have been in there, but I think just ingenuity is core. That when you have unlimited money, it's hard to believe people make good choices or think about what really could work.
Totally. That really reminds me too of that kind of business necessity. I mean, there are a few business necessity cases I talk about in the book, like the one that I really like with Stan Lee, where he was the editor of Atlas Comics, and their whole strategy was just pumping out volume, tons of volume in different genres. And then when their rival became their distributor, and the rival limited them to just a few issues a month, said, oh man, we can't do volume anymore. What are we going to do? We're going to have to do sort of sustained storytelling. And that's when they started doing superheroes with, real life adult problems, anger issues, and, all these other sorts of things. And so it was really that necessity of, we can't do volume now, or Southwest Airlines, that one?
Yeah. This is the alcohol story?
No, I don't know that one. The Southwest Airlines I was going to go with was.
Okay. Wait, so go ahead. You tell me yours, and then I'll tell you mine, because it's one of my favorite business stories of all time.
Okay, so like a year after Southwest started, they were basically dead. They had like $140 in the bank or something. And in order to just make payroll, they had to sell one of their 4 planes. They had 4 planes. All of their routes were in Texas. And so they're like, we have to sell 1 plane to make payroll, but we're really dead without that, because then we can't service you can't fly as many flights. Right. So they decide they have to sell the plane, and this VP of ground operations does the math and realizes they can still do all the flights if they can turn around the planes in 10 minutes instead of an hour. And so that leads to, they're going to line up passengers on the tarmac and bring them in one door while people are going out the other door. The flight attendants are going to be like pulling bags down as soon as it lands. The pilots are going to be help clean the cabin and all this stuff. And they end up turning around the planes in 10 minutes when it had been an hour. And that was the first of like 47 straight years of profit, basically. They may have then been profitable like all up until the pandemic, basically. I think there's
it was 20 years of, and they had more profit than the whole airline industry, I think, over a 20-year period, because their whole business, and actually they're losing it. It was all about constraints. It was non-standard airports. We're not going to do the first class. It was all the things that they weren't going to do. And there's I try to be a student of Southwest. There's a famous story where this woman kept writing to Herb Kelleher, telling her everything she hated about the airline. He wrote back and he said, it sounds like we're not the right choice for you. I knew about their turn advantage, but I didn't know that story. I'll match you it's either Jim Beam, I think. So apparently, like a little further down the road, they were just getting going, and American came in on one of their routes, and I think it was like $80, and American started charging like $60, and they were just going to try to put them out of business because Southwest couldn't. They were just flooding the market with these low cost fares, and Southwest was like, we can't compete. Like, they have more money than us. We need to do something. And this is one of the most famous Southwest stories. Maybe you'll add this. It's still like one of my favorite business stories ever. So someone looked at it and they're like, look, the people flying this route are mostly business travelers. So we'll give them a choice. They can pay the $60, or they pay the $80 and they get a free handle of Jim Beam. And they knew that people were expensing this. And they became the largest distributor in Texas of Jim Beam for like 4 months, because 90% of the people took the alcohol thing because they were expensing the ticket and they got free booze, and American gave up the route, and like Southwest is also still alive because of that story. So I think they're like a history of constraints.
Yeah, that's really funny. It's like they're like one being really resourceful off a constraint after the other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's their DNA. There's also this anecdote you have in the book about scientific research that I thought was interesting, describing this trap where scientists conduct an experiment, sift through the data, and ultimately draw a conclusion that may just be random by chance. Like, how does this happen, and how does this sort of relate? Because I thought that was a little different. Yeah,
this chapter is about the so-called replication crisis in science, the fact that like a lot of famous research has not held up on further review, basically. And a main problem has just been that researchers have too much freedom, basically, in how they make conclusions. And so what what led to this is researchers were doing things like they would make some prediction. You know, I feature nutrition research quite a bit in this chapter because it's a mess. And so a researcher might say, you know, if you're watching an action film versus a romance film, you're going to eat more calories while you're snacking or something. That's their theory.
Yeah.
And they take the data and it doesn't hold up.
It's just too wide. Is that,
what's that?
It's too wide. Like you can't, it's not narrow enough to truly measure what's.
Well, if you stuck to your original hypothesis, but what typically will happen is they'll say, oh, that didn't hold up, but we have all this data, so let's look for other stuff. Yeah. They start sifting and looking for other correlations. And it's very counterintuitive that it's wrong to do that. But basically, for statistical reasons, if you don't stick with your initial prediction, you're retrospectively coming up with your prediction. It's called harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. Your chances of
it being,
you'll basically always find a false positive result by sifting your data that way.
Well, it's like kind of the genesis of a conspiracy theory, right? You can take all these points and point them to some theory that just doesn't exist.
Yeah. And so there's like, I opened that chapter in the book with looking at how this one segment of the National Institutes of Health that had people studying drugs and dietary supplements for cardiovascular health. It's like before the year 2000, most of the drugs and supplements had positive results for health. And then starting in 2000, almost nothing has a positive result. And it's like, did medicine stop working all of a sudden? No. In 2000, they required the researchers to register ahead of time what their hypothesis is, like what's the prediction that they're making. And that simple constraint caused almost all of the results to turn negative, which means that in the past, basically, people were making predictions, they were turning out negative, and then they were sifting the data to find some other positive thing, which means it's all false positives. So there's a ton of drugs and stuff out there now that for sure are just based on false positive results.
Well, interestingly, maybe it's a little bit meta, but I did see this week an article that said the least replicable research all came from higher education. So maybe that's feeding the problem.
That's interesting. Yeah, like from higher education, meaning from academic researchers?
Yeah, from academic research and studies and whatever. Like people, all these, they were the least replicable when they went back and kind of asked them to prove it.
Yeah, I will say the good thing is, I mean, one of the reasons that we figured this stuff out is because academic researchers started calling their colleagues on it.
Yeah.
So I actually think now science is in a much better place. But there's just a ton of, nonsense out there. So one of the studies I cite in that chapter is often referred to as the everything in your fridge causes and prevents cancer study, where these researchers they gathered up all the studies of different foods and found that basically everything had been found both to cause and prevent cancer many times.
Right.
Too much or bacon, too little. Which had only been found to cause cancer. Very sad.
Yeah, bacon's been really not getting a lot of good press lately.
Good for your mental health, maybe. But the point of the chapter, ultimately, I think the replication crisis is very interesting. But then I get into how normal people and businesses can use the scientific testing framework to make better decisions themselves.
Well, I thought you were going to say too, it would seem like the more of things you try to look at are variable and more complicated the thesis, the harder you would have replicating it. That like the narrower the scope, the more you'd be able to really test what you're looking for.
Yeah, and I think that's why in that chapter I cite this research where startup founders were randomized to different types of training for market research, basically. And some of them got training framed as like the scientific method where, okay, you're going to make a hypothesis. It has to be really well defined, and then you're going to find a way to test it. And that forced them to define the problem they thought they were solving really, really explicitly.
Because they're very good narrowly at telling stories. Like,
totally. And moving the goalposts if the story seems like it should change, right? And so in those cases, a lot of those founders ended up realizing that some of their assumptions were wrong, because once they really were forced to explicitly define the problem they thought they were solving and test whether this was a problem
didn't think they could just escape their way out of it, right?
Right.
The pivot is one of the most told, like the Slack pivot, but that is the total survivor bias. Like the 1 out of a million that works, where you can just totally change the whole business premise if it wasn't what you thought it was going to be.
And that was like way into things, right? So in the research that I cite in this chapter, it's people are randomized at the beginning. Like they're early startup founders and they're randomized. And basically a lot of the ones that use the sort of scientific method of market research end up realizing that the problem they think they're solving for end users is not actually the problem that the end users want solved. It's some other problem. And so they end up pivoting very, very early and end up making a lot more money. Whereas the other startup founders more likely just retrofit their story and instead of pivoting and did a lot worse.
I'm curious if you have a thought on this, because I have a thesis, but I am not a scientific researcher. So between COVID and the ZIRP decade, the zero interest rate decade, I think there was an entire group of executives and leaders who were grown up on like no constraints, like more, you solve a problem, you add more people, and all the layoffs now that people are blaming on AI, that's about a quarter true. It's just undoing all this dramatic adding of resources since COVID. My theory is like, I don't think it's that easy to pivot from someone who is used to operating with no resources for a decade of the formative part of your, no constraints, your career, to a constraint orient. Like people act like it's a flip you can switch. And if I'm hiring someone, and this is one thing I'm looking at, like did they just operate with free money, and did they know how to do otherwise?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm speculating, but I think your intuition is right about that. Like we know there've been op-eds, some of the companies that have said, oh, due to AI, we're firing. I think Block was the most recent I saw, where, and then people internally started writing articles saying it absolutely wasn't AI.
They hired 500% growth in employees since 2000 or something like that.
Yeah, right? And so I think AI was just a convenient excuse.
The public market likes that.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think you're right that if you haven't had to work under constraints, you haven't been forced to be resourceful. Like that's going to show up later, right? Like, yeah.
Well, related to that, a piece of advice that you had is if you don't have constraints, make up constraints. How do you recommend leaders do that for their teams?
That was another one that Tony Fadell told me, the Nest co-founder. So to share what he was like, this was the first time I interviewed him. I interviewed him several times. He was almost yelling at me on the phone. You don't have constraints, make up constraints. He's a very enthusiastic guy. And at Nest, for example, he forced his team to work inside a literal box where he had them prototype the packaging before they had the product, because he said, this is what it's going to look like on a shelf to an end user. And so by prototyping this packaging, we're figuring out what are the things that we really want to communicate in this tiny space to the end user. And if it doesn't fit on there, then it's obviously not one of our priorities this time around. And so just those kind of things, as he told me, with these ultra constraint based things, it slows you down, but it really forces this kind of thinking. Yeah. And I think that's why he advises writing the press release also ahead of time. And with the iPod, when he led iPod, he didn't want to, he had been at companies where things drag on and forever, basically. And so he showed Steve Jobs a styrofoam model of the iPod in March of 2001, got the green light and said, 10 weeks for a first version. 10 weeks. Clear user problem, growing music collections in the MP3 era, no way to carry them on the go. And then after 10 weeks, do what some designers call design freeze, where you're done or not, everyone stops, collects their lessons, and then you go to the next version. They ended up shipping in 9 months, going from styrofoam model to shipping in 9 months. He picked Christmas as what he calls external heartbeats, where he wants some external benchmark so everyone can see it's not just the boss making stuff up, kind of, for when they're going to ship. So using constraints like that, there are a number of constraints. If you want me to throw out sort of some thought exercises that I've used with executives. The main mindset shift I hope Inside the Box engenders is from viewing limits as only bad to viewing them as opportunities to clarify priorities and launch productive exploration. And so a few of the thought experiments I've used when I've just been starting out talking about this stuff with people is to pick one behavior. Like if you could only pick a single behavior that you wanted more of in your organization, what would it be? And I think that can be really clarifying for people working on their culture. Or if you had half the time or budget, how would you do this? And one of the first people to read the book was this guy, Ed Hoffman, who was the chief knowledge officer at NASA. It's kind of like the head psychologist. And reading it, he said, I got to tell you about this, like you did with Southwest. He was like, I have to tell you about this NASA mission called L-Cross, where the team ended up with half the time and budget they wanted. And so first they complained, and then they said, if we were going to get this done, how would we get it done anyway? And it forced them to borrow imaging equipment from Army tanks and engine temperature sensors straight from NASCAR. They just pulled them right on NASCAR, and they put them on a probe, and they confirmed water on the moon. And he said they just never would have done this unless they were forced to do it. So doing those kinds of thought experiments, one, stop you what's called a preclude constraint. Take your most familiar tool or your oldest tool and say you can't use it. So if you're going into the next client meeting, if we weren't allowed to propose the thing that we always propose, what would we propose instead? And that can be a really kind of generative prompt. Tell me what you think about this one. Because there's one executive that told me he has a constraint that he's found really useful. He calls it the legacy constraint. And he said he told his team, if we were going out of business in 2 years and only we knew it, our clients and customers didn't, and we couldn't tell them, what would we do differently? And he said immediately people started saying, well, I'd stop focusing on that and I'd focus on this. And his answer was, well, then you should just do that.
Financial advisors and stuff will give clients, if you had a year to live and a day to live and 10 years to live, and it shows that you figure out what's most, as that time goes, you have no idea whether you have a year or a decade to live. Yeah. But as you remove the time thing, people got very specific about what mattered to them most.
Yeah. I think it's like the Stoic philosophers say, memento mori. Every morning you're supposed to remember your mortality, right? That you have limited time. It helps you prioritize. One thing I think that's a useful exercise, whether for people or organizations, because humans have a hardwired what's called additive bias. We always add things in order to solve problems, even when taking away would be better. I describe one organization doing this in the book, is putting all of the current commitments on Post-it notes and put them up on the wall. And usually what you'll see when you do that is that you're overcommitted and that some things are not as important as other things. And so I kind of did that in my own life with my own projects, and then said, if I had to cut something within the next 90 days, what would it be? It doesn't mean you have to kill that thing forever, but you can move it out of the sort of the current funnel. I think that can be really useful. Yeah, really useful.
All right. Well, David, where can people learn more about you and your work? I'm assuming they can buy Inside the Box anywhere books are sold.
Yep. Inside the Box, anywhere books are sold. davidepstein.com. I have a free Substack newsletter that's linked on my website.
I am a subscriber. It's very good. Everyone should subscribe. We'll add that to the recommended list on my Substack too. That.
And there's a few. I have a few sort of tips and some of these exercises I talked about on my website as well.
Okay, great. Well, we'll link all of those. David, thank you for joining us. As I said, I've been a fan of your work for years and really excited to have this opportunity to chat with you. Yeah,
it's a pleasure. And thanks for telling me some of the Southwest story. That Jim Beam one is hilarious. I love it. Yeah, it was. I might have Jim Beam wrong, but it was some cheaper alcohol. But I'll look it up before I retell it. You'll look it up. There are famous articles on it. I'll send you the Substack I actually wrote on it. But you can learn more about David and Inside the Box on the episode page at robertglazer.com. We'll include all the links that we just spoke about. If you enjoyed this episode, if you think someone else could benefit from it, the favor I have is, do you mind just texting it to them or sharing it with them? That's how new users discover the show. So if this episode made you think or see differently, we'd love if you could share it with a friend. And thanks again for your support. Until next time, keep elevating.